Thank you very much. I'd like to start by asking Upinder Singh to frame slightly what we are talking about when we're thinking of this subject on violence. Really, partly because chronologically your book is the start point, but more because there are a lot of ideas in there which are to some extent specific to ancient India, but also have an application that's global and contemporary. Your conclusion starts with the sentence, "Violence is inherent in the state," which made me think of the idea that war makes the state. And in a way, what you're doing is you're taking that argument a little further and saying it is inherent. Can you just position that and explain what you meant a little more fully?
Well, the starting point of my own investigation of a particular kind of violence, political violence, that is violence in the political arena, whether internal to the state in the form of the state's punitive role, the state's right to take life, or whether in relation to other states and forest people and animals. The starting point of my own investigation was a realization that this violence, which is inherent in all states and in politics, is something that we have often been extremely inattentive to and unaware of. And that is partly because in the period that I deal with, unlike perhaps with the periods that the other panelists will talk about, there is a sort of veil of silence. There is a camouflaging, a very elaborate and sophisticated series of camouflaging so that you find that whether it is the celebration of the heroic ideal or whether it is very brief and passing references to forest tribes or whether it is reference to the king as upholder of the social order, all these areas are actually fraught with violence, regardless of the period that we are looking at.
But I mean, to look at that comparatively, I mean, there's sometimes a suggestion that there were certain truths inherent in ancient India, which culturally are regarded as being part of what makes India unique. And I mean, to an extent, you push that aside by going back to the facts.
Well, that is true to some extent. I'm, in my book, not looking at the history of violence, but at how violence in the political arena was the subject of intense inquiry and debate in ancient India. This does, it is true, go counter to some of the ideas that I included actually had about the early Indian past. We have an idea about an ancient India that is marked by a lack of intense conflict, in which there is a great value that is attached to the principle of non-violence. And everybody thinks of the Buddha, Mahavir, and Ashok when you think of ancient India. But I think it's extremely important to look behind the surface and to carefully and critically examine the debates and discussion and disagreements that were going on for hundreds of years in ancient Indian thought. And I think that does clearly indicate to me that what makes ancient India so significantly different is not the absence of violence, but a very intense debate about the interplay and interface between violence and non-violence, especially in the political sphere.
And just touch on the point that you also make about the lack of counter-narratives, the idea that the defeated and the marginal and the forest people don't leave the records, therefore people tend to be dependent on what has lasted, what has been inscribed.
Yes, you only get the state's perspective by and large. So whether it is the political treatises or royal inscriptions, and even texts like the epics, even though they do from time to time present a critique of the violence of the state, ultimately they uphold monarchy. They are making a case for kingship and power and a certain amount of necessary force being inevitably involved in ruling. So the counter narratives are very few. You have to prize them out with great difficulty.
And in a very speculative way, given that they're not there, what's your hunch in terms of how those more marginal groups perceived the violence of the state in ancient India?
Well, that's a very general question. I don't know.
A very
if I
general
want
audience.
to-
We're not in a...
Well, I'm sure that then as now there were victims of state violence, and I can imagine that there must have been a certain amount of, there must have been resentment, there must have been some kind of protest of a different kind, because we're not talking about modern democracies. It's just that the voices against the violence of the state are really very difficult to hear. It's actually, you just have to make a lot of inference.
Right.
You don't get direct evidence at all.
So, Tridip, if I can move to you now and ask about the way that, to some extent, as part of the freedom movement, Nehru in particular, and in a slightly different way, Gandhi presented a kind of long historical take on India in order to sort of justify and drive the political ambition, if you like, of what they were doing. How would you position Gandhi within that? To what extent was it authentically coming out of his Indian heritage, and to what extent was it a strategic move coming out of the fact that he spent much of his early adult life in South Africa fighting a slightly different foe?
Gandhi's understanding of non-violence, ahimsa, is not necessarily derived from the kind of tradition that Professor Singh spoke about. His understanding or his study of the ancient India is very limited, unlike Nehru, who makes an attempt to do that. Gandhi's understanding of non-violence, one, comes from practice, and two, very deep experience of violence in South Africa. So the need for non-violence, both at the level of person and at the level of politics and society and then economy, begins to come to him in South Africa, and that's the narrative that we begin to foreground. But that's only one of the narratives. Increasingly, he feels that non-violence, apart from it being a political ethic, had to be a personal virtue.
Right.
And so he started translating the word ahimsa as love.
Right.
It's actually coming from a very different tradition. So I don't think he inherits, although in the popular perception it's believed that it comes from the Vaishnav Jain tradition of Gujarat, or his, but it would be, I mean, if it is a textual tradition that we're looking at, then we're looking at the Sermon on the Mount. That's the text that he actually engages with in a very deep sort of a way. But it's no, I think for him increasingly non-violence becomes a personal need more than just a political requirement, because he felt that, you know, he says that the more you take to violence, more you recede from the self. And if you recede from the self, neither Swaraj nor salvation are possible.
But I mean, in your new critical edition of his autobiography, you give in some respects a sort of different take on what's become a very standardized version of Gandhi. Can you just give one or two examples of, if you like, the sort of textual study or the archival or historical study that informs what you've written in there?
What one is trying to do is to really look at Gandhi's need to dwell in the ashram while he writes the autobiography. We forget that Gandhi was only an itinerant ashramite. Of the 17 years or 13 years of the ashram's life in Ahmedabad, Gandhi spends 1,520 days in that place, of which 685 days are written when he's writing the autobiography. And he actually takes a sabbatical, announces a sabbatical, that he would not leave the town of Ahmedabad while writing the autobiography. And then he, within a week, corrects himself saying, no, my indwelling has to be in the ashram and not even within the city of Ahmedabad. He does not even go into Ahmedabad. Right? So what I try and seek and do is to see why is the act of writing the autobiography and the fact of him dwelling at the ashram unnecessary. And why is that the presence of the ashram community becomes important. And what are the other practices which become important for him while he's writing it?
Yeah.
We know that it is also the period in which he has the most intense engagement with the Bhagavad Gita.
Right.
282 discourses on the Gita are given during that year, his translation of the Gita also happens during that period. And among the many uneasy things that our town, your and mine, have done is to actually prevent Gandhi from giving those lectures on the sermon,
Right.
which were to take place on every Saturday. Right? So you could imagine the situation. Man decides to dwell within himself, within the language, within the community that he creates, and then also reflect on two texts which are central to his imagination, which were, as he said, were a guide, a moral guide.
Yeah.
The Gita on one hand and the Sermon on the Mount on the other.
But if we take the idea of war making the state, the absolute transformative war that made the modern nation state was World War I, which changed or unraveled politics in all sorts of countries, whether it's India or Egypt or Ireland. It all sort of comes around that time. So what is the significance of the fact that the period you're talking about is sort of roughly 1917 to 1930? How significant is that global history, that surrounding global history?
That's important, but I think before that he has two experiences of two other wars.
Okay.
Both the Zulu rebellion and the Boer War. And in both instances he's on the front, although as an ambulance corps person. But Gandhi's understanding of the empire has begun to change by 1917. And by 1921, we know that there is a clear break in which the way he looks at himself as a subject of the empire, his relationship to the empire has undergone a clear transformation by 1921, which has something to do with the way he'd begun to look at the First World War.
Yeah. But I mean, what do you make, with the benefit of hindsight, what do you make of the way that he tied up with the colonial state on something like what you termed the Zulu rebellion? I mean, the fact that he took that side.
That's why people have called him the stretcher bearer of the empire. He genuinely felt that if justice had to be sought for the people in South Africa, Indians in South Africa, it could be best secured within the rubric and the framework of the empire. And if you were seeking rights within that framework, you had duties to perform. Right? It's only later that he would say that it is my duty to dissolve this empire, and I would be doing my duty only if I dissent.
And what do you make of that characterization of him as the stretcher bearer of empire?
Interesting, slightly unfair historically.
Maya, what do you make of it? I mean, where would you position your own take as a historian of empire, quite a broad historian of empire? How would you, just to sort of keep the Indian aspect initially, what is your take on that period post-World War I, the kind of time that Gandhi was writing?
So, I think there's a longer view question we can ask about the scales on which violence takes place in empire, about the extent to which all states need to use violence, the extent to which all power is an exercise of violence. That said, within this kind of broad, I think, set of themes and relationships between violence and power, we can certainly trace certain moments when there are shifts in the scale and in the rapidity and in the extent of the use of violence. And I think the period after World War I is one of those moments in the British Empire generally. And I think the reason for it, I should point to the fact that we can see this in a whole series of rebellions and quite brutal counterinsurgency movements in the British Empire in the period right after World War I. So we see this, for example, with the Amritsar massacre here in India. We see this in the escalation of violence in Ireland, most very vividly. We see this in the putting down of rebellions in Mesopotamia, the use of air power, the use of poison gas. And I think that what we're witnessing in this moment are two different things coming out of World War I. One of them is technological, quite simply, which is that in World War I, you have the development of and mass production of certain kinds of weapons. I mean, the machine gun, of course, famously comes into its own in the sort of later period of the 19th century and facilitates the scramble for Africa. But in World War I, we have not only the machine gun, but we have poison gas, we have tanks, we have different kinds of artillery, and we have air power coming in. So this is a step change because of technology. But then there's a step change also, I think, because of, for lack of a better word, psychology. You have a whole generation of people who have come through the most brutal and brutalizing global war in world history. And you have veterans, you know, the black and tans, for example, in Ireland are so called because they're wearing surplus World War I uniforms, which is the tan, as well as the black. You have soldiers in India who have, of course, seen action.
And have the training, the crucial training,
Exactly, and you have the same thing going on in Mesopotamia. So you have this whole generation of people who are coming out of this moment. So is Gandhi the stretcher bearer of the empire? Well, Gandhi is also coming out of this moment, right? He's somebody who has, you know, witnessed these transformative, really, in terms of scale, acts of violence around the world. And then he takes a very interesting turn, right? Because his turn is, instead of participating in what becomes a kind of escalating cycle of violence, of insurgency and counterinsurgency around the empire, Gandhi says, wait, I'm going to take a left turn. I'm going to say that the way to break this cycle is to be nonviolent. But I see that as in itself reactive to this moment.
So you think it's a strategic choice based on the fact that a parliamentary system lies behind the power he's fighting?
Well, I wouldn't want to get into the mind of Gandhi, particularly with a much greater expert here, but I would say that if you look at the trajectory of India toward independence as distinct from the trajectory of, say, Ireland or other countries in this, other colonies in the same period, what you will see is that the divergence is in the nonviolence. In the other places, you have this, again, this escalation, this cycling. In India, you don't. And Gandhi's move is, in this sense, I mean, of course, you know, we can say that it's ethically and philosophically very significant, but it's also simply strategically, pragmatically significant because it actually works.
Right, so let's, I just want to connect this up a little bit with Joseph Conrad, the subject of your recent stupendous book, The Dawn Watch. You see, what's interesting in a way about the period that Conrad is living is you've got these sort of two counterforces. One is a liberal force across the empire where physical control is so well entrenched that there's a possibility of appearing to be beneficent. This particularly applies, I think, in South Asia. And yet, with the changes in technology, imperialism was often more brutal and more extreme. And in a sense, what Conrad was writing about was that, because he was tending to take the more far-flung places and witness the very worst. In the period approximately sort of covered by his working life as a figure within empire, I mean, how inherent was violence to what was being done? Was the nature of European imperialism, British imperialism, of itself violent? Or was violence an add-on to another project? So
I think my first reaction to that question is to wonder whether the nature of a certain kind of power is violent. I mean, you know, I mean, I think that to ask if Western empires are violent is, to me, a similar question to asking if nation states are intrinsically violent. And to me, the answer would be yes to both. But I think that there's something sort of deeper going on in that. You know, imperialism is the oldest form of government in world history. It spans, you know, thousands and thousands of years. So is there something that's kind of unique?
But it's quite a different kind of
empire.
Yeah,
so is there something that's unique to this kind of overseas empire? Or is it something that's unique rather to what I was sort of pointing to earlier about World War I and about step changes in scale, range, and extent? Step changes that are sometimes facilitated by technology and step changes that one could argue are also steered by transformations in, one could say, state structures and worldviews. So in that sense, I would say that we do see in the later 19th century, and again, maybe I'm being a bit of a technological determinist today about this, but we certainly do see an escalation in violence, but not just in the European empires. We see this in the process of state building in, say, the Americas. which you look at the process of Western expansion in the United States, for example, which is a phenomenally violent process if you look at what happens to the indigenous peoples. The same thing is happening in Australia. The same thing is happening in, for example, Argentina in the later 19th century, where, as in the United States, as in India, as in Russia, you have the extension of, say, railroad networks, telegraph networks, and so on. But along with the extension of these networks by capitalists and centralized state power, you have the wiping out of indigenous peoples along the way. So I do think that there is something important in this relationship between the expansion of a centralized state, the expansion of certain forms of networked transportation and communications technologies, and the expansion of violence. Whether that is intrinsic to imperialism or not, I guess I would say that this is intrinsic to a certain kind of state expansion. Imperialism is one flavor of that.
Is one yeah. So I mean, actually, maybe all of you can touch on this. I mean, is there anything different in India about the nature or idea of violence? I'm thinking particularly of things like the Indian slap, the Indian beating, the way that if two people get into an altercation in a street, you might end up with one of them slapping the other, rather than in some other cultures, a similar altercation might lead somebody pulling out a gun and shooting the other person. Is there a conception of violence, I mean not necessarily in all of India, but which is visible, which is different to other places? And if so, what does that emerge from?
I don't know about the reactions in altercations, but I do think there is something quite unique in the extent to which ancient Indian intellectuals, religious thinkers, poets, and even kings did dwell on the problem of violence. And there has always been, at least, if you look at the post-6th century BCE period, when you have powerful religious movements, Buddhism and Jainism, which is older than Buddhism, the fact that renunciation and non-violence were made very central civilizational issues by people like the Buddha and Mahavir, and the fact that non-violence as an important element not only in personal conduct but in the discharge of the king's duties, that particular perspective was put forward by the Emperor Ashoka. I think you do not have such a long-lived, intense conversation about the how to reconcile violence and non-violence. I don't think you see this in other parts of the world.
So, I mean, it is to an extent at least a coherent civilizational idea that runs through the centuries. I mean, people sometimes say that India tends not to expand. It doesn't feel it needs to go into large areas of territory, conquer it, exterminate the indigenous people. It's more concerned with what happens internally within the state, even if that may be to some extent violent.
I don't think that's really the way I would put it, because what I've tried to show in my book is the fact that there are different political perspectives. So, for instance, you have what you might describe as a very pragmatic, ruthless approach towards politics that you get in Kautilya's Arthashastra. And on the other hand, you have all these concerns for ahimsa and compassion, which are central to Buddhism and Jainism, but never really take the form of a political philosophy which emphasizes non-violence to any great extent. I think that's an interesting kind of contradiction, that even the religions of non-violence actually do not seem to have been able to make a very strong case for non-violence in the political sphere. So I see a lot of difference and variety in perspectives rather than a single thing.
The acts of violence specified in the Arthashastra are very much to do with creating a particular pragmatic outcome. It's if you do this, this is the punishment.
That's true. So that's what I'd call the Artha view of politics. But there is also the obsession with dharma, the dharma of the king, and this constant attempt to draw the fine dividing line between necessary, legitimate, justified force and unnecessary, unjustified, illegitimate force, that is violence.
Tridip, before I come back to you, I'll just switch back to Maya. Okay, so this idea of the dharma of the king or of the monarch, if you read Queen Victoria's personal papers, a lot of the time she's writing about the need to physically take territory. She'll get letters from people in the field, in South Africa, in parts of East Asia, on the Indian frontier. And she always says, conquer the territory, because it'll help the people who are brought into the British Empire. Is there a completely different conceptual idea of the role of the monarch, the role of the state? Between what Upinder's just been describing?
I mean, the first, one thing that's notable is that there's a completely different set of ideas even within Britain, because when Gladstone, for example, gets these letters saying, please do such and such, he doesn't want to do it. Right, but it's an important, I mean, I think that in the same way that you're saying that there's the Artha vision of politics and the Dharma vision of politics, similarly, one could say that certainly in the British political tradition, there's the hands-off vision of empire and the hands-on vision of empire. The one vision that says, we're better off just trading, we're better off ruling essentially through local deputies, and the other vision that says we're better taking this over, building a big infrastructure, sending our people in, and just putting the boots on the ground. So I think that that's a debate that runs throughout the history of British imperialism.
Well, I mean, except that for that sort of 60-odd years of her reign, they tend to go for the conquest, even if they then put in indirect rule.
I think that's debatable.
Debatable?
I think that there's a very old argument about trade following the flag, and there's one part of the argument that says, trade follows the flag, i.e. the British go out and take something, and then of course all the merchants run in. But in fact, the argument I think is better made and more sustainable to say that the flag follows trade. If you look at the history of British expansion across Asia, and indeed large parts of Africa, and for that matter, parts of North America, you see it as commercial ventures first and state intervention later.
Yeah.
So the point here being that, manifestly the British Empire expands territorially very significantly in the 19th century. But what is the premise behind it? My sense is that in far more often than not, these are overtures which are basically made in order to protect investments. This is, by the way, extremely important for us to bear in mind in the 21st century when we like to say there are no empires, but boy, are there global investments, and there are really big armies. One could say that it's only a matter of time before some of these will be backed up, these investments will be backed up imperially. In any event, so while the British Empire expands significantly in the 19th century territorially, I don't think that it's quite fair to say that that there's a sort of top-down monarchical vision that says we should go expand for the benefit of these people. I tend to take a more sort of pragmatist view of it, which is that the expansion tends to be in the defense of certain kinds of merchant interests. It tends to be lobbied for. The Opium Wars would be an extremely good example of this. The Boer War is another very good example of this, Cecil Rhodes being the engineer of that.
But in an Indian context or a North Indian context, what was the trade benefit of those imperial frontier wars?
The trade benefit was essentially to protect the assets that were behind the frontier.
Okay.
Essentially, if you've got a set of assets and then you're going to be, you're worried about incursions.
So it's like strategic depth.
Well, the other thing that you just retort is something that I actually spoke about in the morning session, which is about the challenges of the military fiscal state. So one of the major reasons that the British end up getting ahead of other European rivals in the 18th century and certainly in the 19th century as an imperial power is that they have a better financial system for supporting their military adventures overseas. But this ends up creating something of a debt trap, because once you're borrowing a lot of money in order to fund your investments and your army to secure the investments, you then have to pay off the debt. And so one of the ways that you pay off the debt in India is that you get territory and you collect taxes on the territory and then you pay the debt. But as your debt mounts, you need to keep finding more sources of revenue. So there are certain ways in which there's a kind of, one could argue, an internal logic to this kind of capitalist empire. Which requires a form of expansion in order to keep itself going.
And which culminates after World War II with Britain owing India a great deal more money than it has in its treasury in total. But let's go back to...
just one tiny footnote on that, which culminates after World War II in Britain owing the United States a huge amount of money, and the United States becoming the major creditor nation in the world, and thus the major imperial power.
Tridip, do you want to touch on this and then go back to the idea of duty, the idea of the role of the king?
Just take up from what where Professor Singh left. This idea of dharma, where there is this overwhelming desire and need to define the boundaries of violence, both within the notion of just violence, necessary violence, kingly violence, violence of the state, but also interpersonal violence. But there is this constant attempt to say, can we limit it? What is very interesting is that at no point do we have a discussion about the limits to nonviolence.
The limits to
nonviolence. Right?
Okay.
I think it is only at one point in which Gandhi begins to think that nonviolence is both limiting and is also limited. Right. The only time that he has a doubt about the efficacy of nonviolence is in Noakhali. Is in Noakhali, 1946, 1947, where both Noakhali and Bihar have turned against each other and turned against themselves. And that's, I think, the darkest point where he begins to think, and I think that's the only instance that I know of, where somebody says, is nonviolence really capable of all the virtues that we've ascribed to them? We've always had an argument about our need to limit violence, but never as to what the limits of non-violence were. And that, I think, is a very important, so just as a kind of a footnote to what she said.
To what extent do you think that the sort of back projection onto Gandhi of an idea, a vision of non-violence is a sort of late 20th century imposition? The idea that he was the person who said, be the change you want to see, as you see on people's T-shirts, which he never in fact said. Yeah. So it's almost as if there's a kind of synthetic Gandhi who people globally appreciate and love and admire and take as some kind of standard. It's not all a fantasy version, but
it's not all fantasy. There are things that he should have said, he could have said, and he ought to have said, and things that he didn't really say, but one of those things. But this idea of Gandhi as a pacifist, and I'm using the word pacifist rather than as somebody who is a thinker and a doer on ahimsa, is, I think, a later projection, which in fact tries to take the edge out of his politics. You turn Gandhi into specifically either as a non-violent person. You forget that there are layers through which he's operating. There are cultural anxieties that he wishes to address through the question of ahimsa and hinsa. There are rough ages in Gandhi's own life and thought in relationship to violence, his need to control his own propensity to violence. All of that really is forgotten. So what you get is a far more easy to handle card box kind of character called M.K. Gandhi, who is a pacifist, or preferably a janitor.
I was recently reading Stephen Kotkin's book on Stalin and thinking, how would this apply if it was in an Indian context? I mean, if Gandhi had been up against a Stalin-type system or leader, would he have pragmatically switched his ideology? Would nonviolence have been efficacious in any form?
I don't know. I don't know, because his need for nonviolence is also deeply personal.
Right,
so I don't know whether in face of absolute tyranny, that need to hear your own voice, to be able to be in communion with yourself and therefore with truth would have disappeared. Because for Gandhi, the need for nonviolence also is because there is the need to be in communion with truth.
But I mean, the idea of the self that you are talking about, are you talking about a modern conception of the self, or is it something that you can track? Okay. So in fact, Gandhi's idea of the self was coming out of his late Victorian experience.
Yes, of course. I mean, he's not speaking of the kind of self through which the Brahminical text would have spoken about.
How would the Brahminical text have spoken out of?
The Brahminical, that question I will not answer. She has to answer. But I think partly it would have been the individuation and the need of the individual would have been very different in those texts, and the placement of the individual at the center of that quest would have also been very different.
Yes.
For Gandhi, it's a very modern quest.
Right.
It is a very modern quest. To tie up the need for personal salvation with political freedom is a very modern placement.
Do you want to touch on that idea of the self and in earlier times?
Well, if you're asking about the Brahminical view
Yeah.
of the self or the individual, then I think that is a question that is not that difficult to answer, because the Brahminical texts, and I'm talking about texts like the Manusmriti, Dharma Shastra, etc., would place the individual within the two frameworks of Varna and Ashrama. So it's very much a duty-oriented society in which the individual's place and function and role is defined by whether it's male or female, or the Varna that individual happens to be born into. So that is the classical Brahminical view.
And do you want to?
Well, if I may, I mean, one thing that I was struck by in your remarks is the question of when moral authority resides with nonviolence as opposed to when moral authority resides with violence, right? And this comes back even to what you were saying about the distinction between these forms of the artha and the dharma. And I think that one of the paradoxes, perhaps, about certainly modern liberal societies is that the moral authority resides with nonviolence, but the actual authority, of course, resides with violence. And so you see these constant, this is exactly the conflict, in fact, between Victoria and Gladstone, right? I mean, this is the moral quandary that a William Gladstone finds himself in, because he knows that and his vision of Christianity supports the idea that nonviolence, not expanding, not conquering people, and so on, is the right way to behave, and yet he also knows that there are certain pragmatic necessities for his state. I think in this regard, it's also interesting to think about the way that this resonates today. Patrick, you asked about whether our vision of Gandhi as a nonviolent hero is retroactively constructed. I think it's interesting to think, too, about whether our vision of the British Empire as being either benign or violent. I mean, how are the debates about that today, playing with this question of the moral authority? One of the things I find notable in the current debates about was the British Empire good or bad, is that even those who are considered to be apologists for British imperial deeds will say, oh, we know Amritsar was really bad. And they'll always point to the one thing that is unequivocally a sort of a single violent act. And yet, if you think about violence in a sort of broader sense, they're not taking it on at all, right? And so that's a quite interesting thing. Twist on it also, you asked about World War I and the wake of World War I. And one of the things that happens out of World War I and the enormous violence that goes with it, and again, the brutalization of a whole generation, is the peace movement. Well, what is the peace movement known for? It is known for appeasement in the 1930s. And what do we now think of as the terrible moral wrong and failure of people in the 1930s, but the appeasement of the fascists,
exactly,
right?
And the tendency to characterize all sorts of different enemies as Hitler.
Exactly, because it is only then that we can give violence a moral authority, when we actually implicitly I shouldn't say implicitly, when we like to believe that nonviolence has the moral authority.
Okay, so before we open up to questions from you, the audience, let's just try and bring the idea of violence sort of forward. There are a couple of things that struck me. One is that if the state has a monopoly on violence, which is principle, going back to Hobbes or even earlier, the idea of this makes the state, what do we do about the fact that there are conceptual states like Islamic State, which are not entirely dependent on holding geographical territory? And pretty much all of those earlier conceptions within political philosophy assumed that you controlled the boundary of the state, rather than the idea that you could start off with a virtual caliphate and then try to extend it onto the ground, that it might be swept away and it might come back. Plus the fact that technology enables people to conduct war without risk from the air through armed drones, something that we're probably only beginning to get used to, the idea that wars can be conducted from the air without any risk at all, apart from the financial one of the drone crashing. There's not even a pilot. Do you want to try to
Well,
touch
covered
on that.
so much.
We have
Because I
covered a
think
lot of
that,
ground in 45 minutes.
I don't know, in the periods that I'm looking at, territory is important, but territorial boundaries are not.
Okay.
And of course, ideas of empire are there. So you're talking about colonial empires. I think if we stretch the story back, we find that although the structures of thought and the structures of control are very radically different, there is, in the ancient text, the idea of world victory. So, the kind of imperialist ambitions that you see manifestations of in, we're talking about post-colonial phase. Of course, the form in which these ambitions, the form that they take and the strategies of control and conquest are very different, but the idea of empire and extensive conquest, on the basis of whatever technology existed at that time, certainly goes back a long way. And moral empire as well. If you look at Ashok, he's not only talking about victory through arms, he's actually what he considers as more important is a kind of a moral imperium which he thinks he exercises over the whole world. So I think it's interesting to actually compare, if you're looking at the history of ideas, to compare these different packages of ideas in very different cultural and chronological contexts.
But if you argue that violence is inherent in the state, in the future, will such a state be possible? I mean, you could say, well, in an Indian context, yes, because the boundaries of the state are very, very clearly defined and securitized, and it's, for example, highly unlikely that any Indian government would shift on geographical territory, and yet there are all sorts of very different places in the world where these borders are dissolving. I mean, look at Islamic State when they did take territory. One of the first things that they did was to post a video of a bulldozer driving over the border, I think, between Iraq and Syria, and saying this is the end of Sykes-Picot. They had a video called "End of Sykes-Picot." Again, going back to this World War I, post-World War I. I mean, are we on the cusp of having to think differently about the state and therefore about violence within the state or controlled by the state?
Well, right now, it seems as though we're living in a world with spiraling violence. I don't see an end to that, and I don't know. I can't visualize a state which is not supported by some amount or some, some elements of violence. It's a wonderful idea, very utopian idea. I don't know whether it's at all possible.
I think what's more worrying really is that there is innovation in terms of forms of violence, both aided by technology, also aided by certain psychology, but there's been very little innovation in terms of non-violence. Where is the moral innovativeness coming from? If you really look at all the forms of practice of non-violence that we have, they seem to have been frozen in some ways in the life of M.K. Gandhi for us, and for other cultures, for other people. In terms of our responses, therefore, to violence, sometimes we find, both morally and also pragmatically, non-violence being less effective, perhaps also because our capacity to innovate in terms of how do you be non-violent has ceased. I don't think that's really a pursuit anymore. For the national movement, for a very large period, or at least a part of the national movement, that moral innovativeness of non-violence was very crucial. And that's something that we seem to have lost.
No, it is strange, that lack of innovation of the conceptualization. I mean, I think maybe it's partly to do with the fact that in so many societies, you get this polarization where people simply disagree with, in an ultimate way, the other side. And therefore, the idea of some kind of collaborative, generative process is not what's going on. I mean, you think of something like the Constituent Assembly debates from 46 to 49. It's kind of inconceivable. Or again, I can't remember what it's called, the US equivalent of the debate that leads to the Constitution. I mean, it's very hard to imagine Democrats and Republicans today sitting down together and saying, let's figure out a better way of making government work.
Sadly true.
Sadly true. Okay, let's have some audience questions. Maybe if you'd like to stand up and ask a question, and we'll maybe take one or two questions together, and then we can answer them.
Yes, in the last year, we've seen about a dozen cases where there's been violence in the world. And we really haven't heard much of an outcry from the West or from the United States. And in fact, in some of these cases, the US president is even, kind of supportive of the violence. Are we seeing that in this year, 2018, we've given messages to governments around the globe that they can go ahead and have free reign to do as much violence as they'd like, and we'll just keep mute and maybe call them terrorists if they're your opposition?
Thank you very much. And there's one, yeah.
I have a couple of related questions actually. I teach political science at Delhi University and I teach a paper called Indian Political Thought. So my questions are to Upinder Singh and to Tridip Suhrud. So a couple of things that distinguish the Brahmanic thought from the Shramanic tradition, which is Jainism and Buddhism, is the former is a theistic tradition, the latter non-theistic, the former that sort of celebrates the Vedic tradition, and the latter rejects the Vedic authority. Would you say that another thing that distinguishes the Shramanic from the Brahmanic tradition is the presence of nonviolence, or the interrogation of nonviolence, and the absence of nonviolence? So the absence of nonviolence in the Brahmanic tradition and the presence of nonviolence in the Shramanic tradition.
Thank you.
And just one related short question. Is it not interesting and perhaps a little curious that Gandhi chose Tolstoy and Thoreau for inspiration to take inspiration for nonviolence and not look to the Indic tradition of the Shramanas?
Tridip's statement that territories are important but territorial boundaries are not. It's very difficult to comprehend this because most conflicts in the world right now are for borders only. And finally they get into the territories only. So how do you explain this? That territories are important but not territorial boundaries, that is borders. Thank you.
Okay, boundaries, strands of thought, violence in the West, and whether there's a kind of open house on individual states doing what they want. Who would like to take up any or some of these questions?
Well, I can take up the question that was about the distinction between Brahminical and Shramanic ideas. I think it's not the presence or absence of gods or god-like objects of veneration. I don't think that is the crucial difference between Brahmanism or Brahminical thought and Buddhism and Jainism. I think what the crucial difference is really the centrality of renunciation in Buddhism and Jainism, and the fact that monasticism has such an important place both for men and women. So I think there is a very close relationship between renunciation and non-violence, and that's another interesting link that perhaps one can think of in Gandhi's own life story.
I'll just take that, and that would probably be a response to the query that you posed. It's true, say the early exemplars of young Gandhi are thinkers of a particular kind which emerged from Europe. Let's not forget that this 17-year-old boy from Kathiawad finds himself in London. His exposure even to the Bhagavad Gita is through a translated work. It's only later that he begins this very sustained practice of textual reading, and that would come much later. But the early texts that he reads are texts which emerge from a certain understanding of what's happening to industrial or industrializing Europe, where Thoreau, Ruskin, the vegetarian movement, Tolstoy play a very important part, and so do the Esoteric Christian Union. So yes, partly true. But I think in terms of the practice, where the idea of the ashram, which becomes so central to his life, to his politics, and to his own self, is not necessarily coming to him from those traditions. Of course, Gandhi's ashram suspiciously resembled, at least in South Africa, to the Trappist monastery which was next door, including its architecture. and also the timetable that they followed to begin with. It's only later that they began to mirror the timetable of the prison. And both, I think, as a preparation to prison going, as also the kind of discipline that it sought to bring. So yes, there is a part of Gandhi where it's deeply influenced by European thought of a particular kind, but the institutional innovations that come draw upon the earlier experiences. But of course, his ashrams are very different from the kind of ashrams that we spoke of in.
But Tridip, I mean, you quote his collaborator, Sonia Schlesin, writing him a letter. Dear Mr. Gandhi, just time for a line by this mail to ask you on no account to publish the allusions to myself in your wretched autobiography. And then gives various corrections and says, you call me the head of a girls' school, I never had anything to do with the girls' school, and so on. I mean, can we rely on this text?
We should.
Why?
If you're looking for facts, then you read mine. Right? If you're looking at exact notes, dates, people, places, full titles of the text which he quotes, then you have to look at the notes. I think what Gandhi says at one point, while writing the autobiography, and he differentiates between what he calls a real autobiography and the autobiography that I'm going to write. And what I'm going to write is not a real autobiography in the sense that it has fidelity to facts. What here is something which is driven by what he calls the indweller, the dweller within, Antaryami. And it is at the promptings of the Antaryami that you will write. And therefore, very interestingly, all the errors which are pointed out to him while the autobiography is being written and published every week, not one change is made in the autobiography, including errors which were pointed out by people as close to him as Henry Pollock. Right. Because he felt that this was being done at the prompting of the Antaryami. And therefore, that need not be corrected. And therefore, you need annotations.
So would any other members of the audience like to ask a question, particularly younger members of the audience and the students that I can see here? One in the front row, and then one just behind there, yeah.
Can I go first?
Yeah, go for it, yeah.
Right, so this is a question related to Buddhism as we were talking about earlier. So considering how imperialism has actually fueled the development of military technology, which in turn has fueled more violence, would you say that it's possible that the fact that Brahminical traditions deeply engage with the idea of violence, would you say that actually enabled early Hindu states, to wipe out Buddhism and Jainism? Is that a possibility?
Okay, then there was another question nearby, just here, and then there's one in the front row.
Hi, I'm a student here, and my name is Ravi. I find it quite ironic that when we are in a panel that is discussing violence in Jaipur right now, we have not been addressing the violence that has been happening in the city about a piece of fiction by a not-so-private entity called Karni Sena, which has, again, a lot of state sponsorship by private members of the parliament and whatnot. So my question is, in such a socio-political environment where the state is almost having a complete ownership of violence against the marginalized sector, is it just a lack of innovation in non-violence, or is it a complete breakdown of non-violence and its relevance to today's state?
Thank you. And then one last question here in the front.
My question is to Mr. Suhrud. When Upinder Singh's book was released, there was a review in the newspaper, and in the opening paragraph, the writer suggests that Gandhiji's non-violence was based on the fact that there was so much violence in India. So I wanted to ask you, Mr. Suhrud, what is your view on this?
Okay. All right, so we've got three questions there. One is about Buddhism and Jainism and how they were potentially marginalized by the power of what in retrospect we're calling Hinduism. One was about Padmavati and all of the subsequent issues around acts of violence, not necessarily by the state, but by individual groups claiming sort of the power to exercise their view. And then the specific point about your book, but Tridip has to answer, so I think I'll offer Upinder also the opportunity to answer. So Maya, do you want to go first on any of those?
I actually would like to link the question about what's happening now in India to the point that was made earlier about a dozen acts of violence in the last year, and say that I wish it were only a dozen acts of violence in the last year. There are millions of acts of violence all the time.
Globally, you're talking.
And
globally,
yeah. And I think that one of the questions that's been sort of lurking in this panel discussion that we maybe haven't articulated clearly enough is about: are we talking about state violence? Or are we talking about non-state violence? And what are the scales in between? So you know the definition of the state as the having the legitimate monopoly on the use of force, right? Well, manifestly, legitimate maybe in terms of law could be true, but manifestly the state does not have a monopoly on the use of violence. And I think that one of the issues that I find very interesting in the way that discussions of violence are held in the international arena, and certainly on the national stage in the United States, is that it's often focused around certain visions of what violence is. So violence of a state against another state. But what do we make of the kinds of violence that are, now we could say the drone is a version of this, but what about the kinds of violence that lead to dozens of people being killed in a fire in a factory in Delhi just a few days ago, right? This is a form of violence as well. So, I think that what your question touches on is something about the scales in which this is taking place. And I think that it has always been, I think that phrase of the state having a legitimate monopoly on the use of force, the weight of that phrase rests in legitimate, because force and the use of force lies with many, many other groups. And nowadays, partly because of the idea that nonviolence has the moral authority, I think that states are very keen in certain liberal societies to try to sort of push the violence onto slightly different groups. We have this in the United States with certain kinds of far-right organizations now, to push it onto these different groups to let them take the moral opprobrium. But I think that we shouldn't let them get away with it.
Okay, thank you for that widening out. We've only got 2 minutes. I'd like to talk about this issue a little further, but Tridip, why don't you speak, and then Upinder can have the last word.
No, to respond to, yes, Gandhi is a person of his times also. Right? There is a part of Gandhi which we are able to bring to our present in parts. Not all parts of Gandhi can be brought to our present, but his responses, both in terms of the modes of thought as also the modes of doing, are responses to what's also happening around him. But he has the capacity to ask fundamental questions even at those times, and come up with very strange answers. For example, it is as an ambulance corps worker that he asks himself the question: what allows one, not only him, anyone, to do seva? Right? Now, that's not, yes, it is a contingent question, but it's a larger question. And his answer is very strange: celibacy. So I think, so even on the questions of nonviolence, he is responding to things that happen around him, but both his references, also the time scale, are not necessarily conditioned by the here and now in every instance. Quite specifically, in many instances, yes, not always. And that's why I think he is so fascinating.
Well, there's no evidence that suggests that the Buddhists and Jains were the target of any massive state-sponsored violence in ancient India. I think we have to question these assumptions that we make about certain religious traditions being inherently non-violent. If you think about Buddhism, for instance, there's a great deal of violence that is part of the history of Buddhism, whether it is in Sri Lanka or whether it is in Southeast Asia, for instance, what we see in Myanmar today. So I think we need to really look beyond these conventional boundaries and try to see how in many ways states, regardless of their religious orientation, were as brutal as as each other in the exercise and pursuit of power.
Well, thank you to all three professors, Maya Jasanoff, Upinder Singh, Tridip Suhrud, for keeping it very entertaining and intelligible for an afternoon audience.